A poor girl strawberry seller is rejected by a luxury store, unaware she's the CEO's daughter. Before the story begins, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh fruit, as Sophie Carter crouched in the strawberry field behind her family's cottage. The dewdrops clung to the leaves, sparkling like tiny gems in the early sunlight. She wiped her hands on the hem of her worn apron, though it did little to remove the deep red stains of crushed berries from her fingertips. The sweet scent of strawberries had become part of her, sinking into her skin like an unshakable perfume. It was a smell she had known all her life, a scent of warmth, struggle, and memories of long summer days spent working alongside her mother. Sophie had been tending these strawberry fields for as long as she could remember. At 19, she no longer saw them the way a child would, with endless rows of green plants bursting with scarlet fruit. Now she saw the farm for what it truly was, a livelihood, a responsibility, a never-ending battle against unpredictable weather, pests, and dwindling sales. She sighed, brushing a loose strand of auburn hair from her face before carefully placing a handful of ripe strawberries into one of the wooden baskets beside her. Her mother had taught her the art of picking only the best ones, firm and fragrant, their flavor richer than anything sold in the city. The farm had been in her family for generations, passed down like an unspoken promise of hard work and perseverance. It wasn't a large farm, nothing compared to the sprawling estates owned by the wealthier families of Millington, the nearby town. Their cottage, with its faded blue shutters and a roof in desperate need of repair, stood at the edge of the fields. It was small and simple, but it was home. Sophie wiped her brow and stood, stretching the stiffness from her limbs. The sun was already climbing higher, a reminder that she was running out of time. The Saturday morning market was their biggest opportunity to sell, and she had to hurry. Her mother, Evelyn, was inside, resting her aching joints, her arthritis making it impossible for her to do the work she once had. It pained Sophie to see her mother struggle. The once vibrant woman who had taught her how to coax the best berries from the soil now winced with every movement, her hands curled stiffly from years of labor. Sophie had taken over the farm's responsibilities gradually, but it had happened faster than she'd ever expected. Each morning she woke before dawn, carrying the weight of their survival on her shoulders. There were days when she felt strong, determined, proud even, of the resilience they had built together. But there were also days, like today, when doubt crept in, whispering in her mind, telling her that no matter how hard she worked, it would never be enough. She loaded the baskets onto the old wooden cart, securing them with ropes before pulling it down the narrow dirt road that led to town. It was a routine she had done 100 times before, but today she felt a gnawing unease in her chest, a strange feeling that change was looming just beyond the horizon. The town square was already alive with the chatter of vendors and early shoppers by the time she arrived. She set up her stall quickly, arranging the baskets neatly, ensuring the best berries were placed at the front to catch the eye of passers-by. The market was a patchwork of scents: freshly baked bread from the bakery, the sharp tang of citrus from the fruit stand next to hers, and the comforting aroma of roasted coffee from the cafe across the street. "Good morning, Sophie," called Mrs. Perkins, the kindly old woman who owned the bakery. "I need your best strawberries today. Got a wedding cake order, and nothing less than perfection will do." Sophie managed a smile, reaching beneath her stall for the basket she had set aside. "I saved these for you. They're the sweetest ones from this morning's harvest." Mrs. Perkins beamed, handing over a few crisp bills. "That's why I always come to you, dear. No one else grows them quite like the Carters." Sophie's heart swelled with a quiet pride, but the moment was fleeting. As the morning rush faded, she found herself gazing beyond the market, toward the imposing sight of Hartley's department store. Its glass facade shimmered in the sunlight, towering over the quaint shops of Millington like a palace in the midst of a village. Hartley's was the kind of place where people like her didn't belong. The customers who walked through its grand revolving doors wore fine clothes, their shoes clicking against the marble floors inside. Sophie had never stepped foot in there, never had a reason to. Yet something about it always caught her attention. It represented a world so far removed from her own, a world of luxury and excess, where no one worried about bills or the next bad harvest. She exhaled, shaking off the thoughts. She had work to do. Daydreaming about a life beyond the strawberry farm was a luxury she couldn't afford. But today was different. Today she had a reason to go inside, A letter had arrived the day before addressed to her mother. The envelope had been expensive, made of thick, cream-colored paper with elegant gold lettering. It was an invitation to a charity gala at Hartley's, celebrating their 75th anniversary. Former employees were being honored, and her mother's name had been included. Evelyn had dismissed it immediately. "It must be a mistake," she'd said, pushing the letter aside. That was another lifetime. But Sophie had seen something in her mother's expression, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. Longing, maybe. Regret. Whatever it was, Sophie couldn't ignore it. Her mother had worked at Hartley's before Sophie was born, but she never spoke about it. It was a part of her past locked away, hidden behind years of struggle and survival. Sophie had made a decision then. She would go to the store, just for a moment, to buy one of the charity brooches mentioned in the letter. The proceeds went to the local children's hospital, and they were being sold exclusively at Hartley's. It wasn't much, but it was something, a way to give her mother a small piece of the world she had once been part of. As the morning wore on and the market crowd began to thin, Sophie arranged for Billy, the apple vendor's son, to watch her stall for an hour. "You going somewhere fancy?" Billy teased as she changed into a modest blue dress behind the stall, brushing the dust from her worn shoes. "Just running an errand," she said quickly, tying her long hair back with a ribbon. Her heart pounded as she walked toward Hartley's, the grandeur of the store looming closer with every step. The doormen, dressed in pristine uniforms, opened the doors effortlessly for the wealthy customers strolling in. Sophie hesitated before stepping inside, immediately feeling the shift in atmosphere. The air was different here, cool, perfumed, and heavy with an unspoken expectation that only certain people belonged. She took a deep breath, pushing away the creeping sense of inadequacy. She wasn't here to shop for herself. She had a purpose. What she didn't know was that this simple act, this one small step beyond the world she had always known, was about to change everything. Sophie Carter had never once stepped inside Hartley's department store. She had passed it countless times, gazing up at its towering glass facade as it loomed over Millington's Market Square like a castle untouched by time. It was a place that did not welcome people like her. People with dirt under their fingernails, hands stained red from early morning strawberry picking, and shoes that had walked the same well-worn paths through fields and market stalls for years. The customers who glided in and out of Hartley's belonged to another world entirely, their laughter light, their perfumes heavy, their clothes crisp and unburdened by the weight of hard labor. She had always imagined the inside of Hartley's to be as unreachable as the pages of the glossy magazines that sometimes made their way into the town library, places where chandeliers glowed like frozen sunlight and velvet-lined counters displayed treasures that cost more than she and her mother made in an entire year. But imagining it was one thing. Entering it was something else entirely. And yet today she stood before its grand entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wasn't here to gawk or dream. She had a purpose. The letter had arrived the day before in a heavy cream envelope, its edges perfectly straight, untouched by the creases of wear. It bore the golden crest of Hartley's in the corner, and inside, in elegant cursive, was an invitation addressed to Evelyn Carter. A charity gala, the 75th anniversary of Hartley's department store, where former employees were to be honored for their contributions to the store's legacy. Sophie had been stunned. Her mother had once worked at Hartley's. The revelation felt like discovering that the wind had a name, or that the sun had once belonged to someone else before taking up its place in the sky. It made no sense. Evelyn had never spoken of a past that involved fine jewelry and polished glass counters. Her world had been the farm, the soil, and the struggle of making ends meet after Sophie's father had disappeared like a ghost that had never intended to stay. When Sophie had shown her the letter, her mother had barely glanced at it before pushing it away, her fingers trembling more than usual. "It must be a mistake," she had said, shaking her head. That was another lifetime. But Sophie had seen something in her mother's expression, something raw, something that flickered in the depths of her eyes like an ember buried beneath ashes. Longing, regret. The invitation wasn't just a mistake. It was a key to a past Sophie had never been told about. Evelyn had refused to attend, her body too frail to manage the journey into town, her spirit too heavy with whatever ghost the invitation had stirred. But inside the envelope had been a smaller note about commemorative brooches, special keepsakes made for the occasion. The proceeds from their sales were to be donated to the local children's hospital. Sophie had counted her savings that night. 50 pounds, the exact amount the brooch was said to cost. It wasn't much, but it was everything to her. She couldn't give her mother back the years she had lost, but she could give her a piece of something that had once been hers. And so, she had left the market in the hands of Billy, the apple vendor's son, changed into her best dress, a simple blue cotton piece that had once belonged to her mother, and walked toward Hartley's with all the determination she could muster. Now, standing before its doors, she hesitated. She clenched her fists at her sides, willing herself not to turn back. She had a right to be here. Drawing a breath, she stepped forward. The doormen, dressed in crisp navy uniforms, opened the gleaming doors effortlessly for the finely dressed woman in front of her. When Sophie followed, they hesitated for just a fraction of a second before allowing her through. But she had seen the flicker of doubt in their eyes, the way they measured her by her simple shoes and the way she held herself, not like someone who belonged here, but like someone who was trespassing. Inside, the world shifted. The air smelled of something foreign, expensive perfume, polished wood, a hint of freshly brewed coffee from an unseen cafe. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting golden light across the marble floors. Plush rugs softened the sound of careful footsteps. Sophie tried to ignore the weight of it all pressing down on her. She walked with purpose toward the information desk, where a woman with pearl earrings and an air of sharp efficiency glanced up at her. "May I help you?" Her tone was polite, but there was something clipped about it, something that said she was already prepared to refuse whatever Sophie was about to ask. "I'm here to purchase one of the charity brooches for the anniversary gala," Sophie said, keeping her voice steady. The invitation mentioned and they were 50 pounds. The woman's gaze flicked over her attire, her lips pressing together ever so slightly. "The limited edition Hartley's collection is in our fine jewelry department. The pieces start at 500 pounds. Sophie's stomach dropped. "No, I mean the charity brooch, the one for the hospital donation. My mother was invited to the gala, but she couldn't attend, and I wanted to buy one for her as a gift." The woman's smile did not reach her eyes. "I'm afraid those are only available to distinguished guests of the gala." Sophie's hands curled into fists at her sides. "But next, please." The woman looked past her, dismissing her as easily as if she were an inconvenience, a speck of dust on the pristine marble floor. Humiliation burned through Sophie's veins. She swallowed the lump in her throat, her face hot with shame. She had never felt smaller, never felt so utterly out of place as she did in that moment. She turned away quickly, her vision blurring as she moved toward the exit, each step echoing in her ears like a drumbeat of rejection. But before she could reach the doors, a voice cut through the air. "What seems to be the problem here, Mrs. Collins?" The voice was deep, commanding, rich with authority that made the entire room seem to pause. Sophie stopped mid-step, her breath catching in her throat. A man stood near the counter, watching the interaction with piercing dark eyes. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that spoke of wealth and power. Silver streaked through his neatly combed hair, lending him an air of distinction. There was something about him, something that made people straighten their backs, that made them listen. The woman at the desk immediately adjusted her posture. "Nothing at all, Mr. Hartley," she said swiftly. "Just explaining our policy on commemorative items to this young—" "Miss Carter," Sophie supplied, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Sophie Carter." Something flickered across his face, a hesitation, a moment of recognition so brief she almost missed it. "Carter," he echoed. "And you mentioned your mother was invited?" "Yes, Evelyn Carter," she said. "She used to work here, a long time ago." Mr. Hartley went completely still. His expression, once unreadable, softened ever so slightly. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost reverent. "Evelyn," he murmured, as if saying her name after a long, long time. He turned to the woman behind the desk. "Get Miss Carter one of the brooches from my office," he said firmly. "The special collection. Immediately." The woman blinked, caught off guard. "But, sir—" "Now?" As the woman scurried away, Mr. Hartley looked back at Sophie, his dark eyes unreadable. "Would you join me for tea in my office?" he asked, his voice measured. I'd be very interested to hear how Evelyn is doing these days. Sophie hesitated, confusion swirling inside her. She didn't understand why, but something told her that whatever had just happened was about to change everything, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. Sophie Carter felt the weight of 100 unseen eyes pressing down on her as she stood in the grand lobby of Hartley's department store. The gold-trimmed chandeliers cast shimmering reflections across the polished marble floor, and the faint melody of classical music floated through the air. Around her, finely dressed shoppers strolled with confidence, their heels clicking softly against the stone, their arms weighted down with bags filled with luxuries Sophie could never afford. She felt out of place. Her mother's dress, though clean and neatly pressed, was outdated, its fabric softened by years of wear. Her shoes, polished as best as she could manage, still bore the faint marks of soil from her morning at the strawberry fields. Even the ribbon in her auburn hair, tied carefully into a simple bow, seemed like a relic from another world compared to the elegant scarves and jeweled accessories worn by the women around her. But she had come for a reason. Her mother's invitation to the Hartley's anniversary gala had been a surprise, but the charity brooch mentioned in the letter had felt like an opportunity. £50 was a fortune to Sophie. It was money that could have gone toward groceries or firewood for the colder months, but she had set it aside anyway. She wanted her mother to have something special, a connection to the past she had kept buried. Sophie clutched her small purse tightly as she approached the information desk, where a woman with sleek blonde hair and a pearl necklace arranged paperwork with meticulous care. The name tag on her lapel read, Mrs. Collins. Sophie cleared her throat. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm here to buy one of the charity brooches for the anniversary gala. The invitation said there are £50. The woman's gaze flicked up, assessing Sophie in an instant. Her eyes lingered a moment too long on the hem of Sophie's dress, on the shoes that weren't made of leather, on the hands that still held faint stains of strawberry juice despite Sophie's careful scrubbing. The limited edition Hartley's collection is located in the fine jewelry department, Mrs. Collins replied coolly. Prices start at £500. Sophie's stomach tightened. No, I mean the charity brooch, the one for former employees. My mother, Evelyn Carter, was invited to the gala, but she couldn't attend. I wanted to buy one as a gift. Mrs. Collins' expression didn't change. If anything, it hardened. I'm afraid those items are reserved exclusively for distinguished guests of the gala. Sophie hesitated. But the invitation said anyone could buy one for charity. I have the money right here. She reached into her purse, pulling out the carefully folded bills, each one earned through weeks of waking before dawn, tending the fields, and selling strawberries in the market. Mrs. Collins barely spared it a glance. The brooches were created as commemorative pieces for our esteemed guests. Not everyone is eligible to purchase one. The words were spoken with icy politeness, but the meaning behind them stung like a slap. Sophie felt heat rise to her face. I don't understand. I'm not asking for charity. I want to buy one, just like everyone else. A well-dressed couple stepped up behind her, their expensive perfume wafting through the air, their hushed conversation carrying effortlessly. The man shot Sophie a glance, his lips twitching slightly, as if bemused by the audacity of someone like her standing at the counter. Mrs. Collins barely concealed her impatience. As I said, the commemorative items are not available to everyone. Now next, please. Sophie's hands trembled as she clutched her money. A lump formed in her throat, hot and stinging. She had been dismissed, not because she couldn't afford the brooch, not because they were sold out, but because she wasn't the right kind of person to purchase something from Hartley's. The shame was unbearable. Tears burned at the edges of her vision, but she refused to let them fall. She wanted to argue, to demand that Mrs. Collins explain why she had been turned away when the invitation had said otherwise. But the woman had already moved on, speaking warmly to the wealthy couple behind her, as if Sophie had never existed. She turned sharply on her heel and walked away, her heart pounding in her chest, her ears burning with humiliation. She barely noticed where she was going, her mind spinning. She had worked so hard to come here, to find the perfect gift for her mother, to do something good. And yet, with a few simple words, she had been reminded of exactly where she belonged. Not here, not in a place like this. As she neared the exit, she clenched her jaw and forced herself to swallow the lump in her throat. She would leave, go back to the market, Pretend none of this had happened. Then a voice rang out. What seems to be our only problem here, Mrs. Collins? The deep, commanding tone sent a ripple through the room, silencing conversations and turning heads. Sophie stopped mid-step. The speaker was a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit, his presence radiating quiet authority. Silver streaked his dark hair, giving him an air of distinction, and his sharp eyes carried a weight that made people listen when he spoke. Mrs. Collins straightened at once, her cool indifference shifting into something more measured. Nothing at all, Mr. Hartley, she said swiftly. I was simply explaining our policy on commemorative items to this young— Miss Carter, Sophie interrupted, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Sophie Carter. Mr. Hartley's gaze snapped to her, his eyes narrowing slightly. Carter? He echoed. There was something strange in his expression, a flicker of something Sophie couldn't place. And you mentioned your mother, he asked, his voice quieter now. Sophie hesitated. Evelyn Carter. She used to work here. A long time ago. For a moment, Mr. Hartley went completely still. Mrs. Collins shifted uncomfortably, clearly eager to move on from the conversation. But Mr. Hartley didn't look away from Sophie. Evelyn, he murmured, almost to himself. His eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. When he spoke again, his voice carried an edge of something Sophie couldn't identify. He turned to Mrs. Collins. Get Miss Carter one of the brooches from my office. The special collection. Miss Collins blinked, caught off guard. Sir, those are— Immediately. The authority in his voice left no room for argument. As Mrs. Collins hurried away, Sophie stood rooted to the spot, her pulse thrumming in her ears. Why had the mention of her mother's name caused such a reaction? Why had Mr. Hartley, the very man whose name adorned the store, given her something so exclusive, something far more valuable than the simple silver brooch she had originally sought? Mr. Hartley turned back to her, his expression unreadable. I'd like to speak with you, he said. Would you join me for tea in my office? Sophie hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to refuse. But something about the way he looked at her, like he knew something she didn't, made her nod. As she followed him past the glittering displays, past the eyes that followed her with curiosity and confusion, a thought struck her. This wasn't just about a brooch anymore. Something had just shifted in her world, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for what came next. Sophie Carter's pulse pounded in her ears as she followed Mr. Alexander Hartley through the gilded hallways of his department store. The weight of a dozen curious glances burned into her back, each one whispering a silent question. Who is she? Why is she with him? Just moments ago, she had been humiliated, turned away by a woman who had dismissed her without a second thought. And now, the very name that had sealed her rejection had changed everything. Carter. When Mr. Hartley had heard her last name, something in him had shifted. His confident composure had faltered, if only for a second. He had looked at her like she was a ghost from the past, something unexpected but unmistakable. And now, as he led her toward his private office, Sophie couldn't ignore the way his presence commanded respect. The way employees stepped aside as he passed, bowing their heads, adjusting their ties. He was a man of power, wealth, untouchable. And yet, here she was. Her mother's name had stopped him in his tracks. Sophie's hands trembled as she clutched the small velvet box that had been pressed into her palm moments earlier. She hadn't even opened it yet. It wasn't the simple silver brooch she had come for. This was something more, something she wasn't meant to have, something that had been locked away in his office. Her heart raced. What was happening? What had her mother, Evelyn Carter, meant to this man? As the heavy wooden doors to his office swung open, Sophie hesitated. Come in, Mr. Hartley said softly, standing aside to let her pass. The room was breathtaking, nothing like the gleaming, polished floors of the store below. It was a world of dark mahogany and deep leather, an office carved out of history itself. Large windows framed the city skyline, letting in streaks of golden afternoon light. A grand desk sat near the back of the room, but Mr. Hartley didn't take a seat behind it. Instead, he gestured toward the plush chairs in the center of the room, a setting meant for something more personal. Please, he said, his voice almost hesitant. Sit. Sophie hesitated for only a second before sinking into one of the chairs. Mr. Hartley followed suit, settling into the chair opposite her. He exhaled, rubbing a hand across his jaw, as if struggling to decide where to begin. You said your mother's name is Evelyn Carter, he finally said, his voice measured, careful. Sophie nodded. Yes. His eyes darkened, something shifting behind them, an emotion too complex to name. And she used to work here? His voice was different now, quieter, more fragile than she would have expected from a man like him. Yes, Sophie repeated, a nervous edge creeping into her voice. A long time ago, but she never really talked about it. I didn't even know until the invitation arrived yesterday. Mr. Hartley leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, his fingers steepled together in front of him. Evelyn, he murmured again, as if saying the name aloud anchored him to something he had long forgotten. Sophie couldn't take it anymore. The silence was suffocating. You knew her, didn't you? She asked, her voice breaking slightly. His dark gaze met hers, and in that moment, Sophie knew. Not only had he known her mother, he had loved her. A lump formed in her throat. For years she had wondered about her mother's past. Why Evelyn Carter never spoke of her life before the farm. Why there were no photographs of old friends. No stories about the days before Sophie was born. And now, sitting across from one of the most powerful men in the country, she realized that part of her mother's past had been sitting in this very office all along. You look like her, Mr. Hartley said suddenly. His voice was barely above a whisper. Sophie's breath caught. His gaze roamed over her features, his expression unreadable. It was an intensity that made her shift in her seat, unsure if she wanted to run or demand answers. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then softly he said, I knew Evelyn Carter better than anyone in this world. Sophie's heart nearly stopped. She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Mr. Hartley leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Your mother wasn't just an employee here, he continued. She was one of the most talented jewelry designers I'd ever met. She had a gift, an eye for detail, for beauty. She was going to change everything. He let out a quiet, bitter chuckle. And then one day she was gone. Sophie swallowed hard. Guilt. It was there, lingering beneath his voice like an old wound that had never quite healed. She never told me why she left, he admitted. I searched for her, but she had disappeared completely. No word, no explanation. And now, after all these years, he exhaled, his gaze locking onto hers. Her daughter walks into my store, asking for a brooch made for her mother's honor. The air in the office had turned heavy, thick with unspoken words. Sophie's fingers tightened around the velvet box in her lap. What happened between you? She asked, her voice quiet, cautious. He hesitated. Then, after a long moment, he said, I loved her. Sophie's heart clenched. I loved her more than anything, he continued, but I was a coward. I was young, and there were expectations placed on me, ones I was too afraid to differ. My father had arranged my future before I even had a say in it. And Evelyn, he trailed off, shaking his head. She deserved more than the life I was trapped in. And yet, I wanted her anyway. Sophie's breath came faster. Then why didn't you fight for her? She demanded, her voice cracking. Mr. Hartley flinched. I should have, he admitted, but when I finally realized that, she was already gone. A silence stretched between them, thick with years of lost time. Sophie pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions threatening to pull her under. Her mother had suffered for years, alone, struggling to keep the farm afloat, to raise Sophie with nothing but the earth beneath their feet and the will to survive. And this man, this powerful man, had once held her heart? Had he known what she went through? Did he care? Sophie stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Mr. Malika Toshton. Hartley rose too, concern flashing across his face. Sophie, I have to go, she said, her voice thick. I can't, I don't. She shook her head, backing toward the door. She needed air. She needed space. She needed to get away before the walls of this place crushed her. Sophie, wait, Mr. Hartley said urgently, stepping forward. There's more you need to know. But she was already reaching for the door. She had come here for a simple brooch. Instead, she had uncovered the kind of truth that shattered worlds. She wasn't ready for this. Not yet. What do you think about Sophie's shocking discovery? Should she listen to Mr. Hartley or walk away? Let's hear your thoughts in the comments. If you're loving Sophie's journey, don't forget to like and share. Every bit of support helps us tell her story. Follow for the next part, because the truth is only just beginning to unfold. Sophie Carter gripped the arms of her chair, her breath shallow, as her mother, Evelyn Carter, sat motionless across from Alexander Hartley. The air in their tiny cottage kitchen was thick with tension, the unspoken words between them pressing down like an unbearable weight. The only sound was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, each second stretching the silence further, until it felt like it might break her. Sophie's entire world had already shifted once today, first at the department store, when Alexander Hartley had spoken her mother's name like it was something sacred. And now it was shifting again, twisting into something unrecognizable, something she wasn't prepared for. Her mother's hands, frail from years of hard labor, trembled as she traced the edge of the golden strawberry brooch that lay between them. It glowed under the dim kitchen light, its tiny ruby-studded seeds catching every flicker of movement. This is where it all began, Sophie thought numbly. This small, delicate piece of jewelry had pulled her into something far bigger than she could have imagined, something that had been hidden from her for 19 years. Mom? Sophie's voice barely came out, cracking as she spoke. What's going on? Her mother's face was pale, her lips pressed together as if she were physically holding back words that had been buried for decades. Alexander Hartley, still in his expensive suit, looked out of place in their humble cottage. But his expression had changed since he first walked in. The usual confidence, the air of command, gone. In its place was something raw, vulnerable, desperate. He was looking at her mother like she was the only thing in the world that had ever mattered. And Sophie suddenly knew. Before they even said the words, she knew. She clutched the edge of the table. Tell me the truth. Her mother's breath shuddered. Her eyes lifted, locking onto Sophie's, filled with so much pain that it made her chest ache. I should have told you a long time ago, she whispered. Sophie's heart pounded. I should have told you the truth about who your father is. The room swayed. Sophie froze. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She looked at Alexander Hartley, at the way he was watching her, not with the distant politeness of a stranger, but with something else, something aching, a father's regret, a father's longing, a father's love. Her lungs refused to work. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, that doesn't make sense. That can't be true. She could barely hear herself, her own voice drowned out by the pounding in her ears. Her mother was crying now, silent tears slipping down her face. It's true, Sophie. The chair scraped loudly against the floor as Sophie shot to her feet, backing away like she had been burned. Alexander stood, his hands clenched at his sides, like he was forcing himself not to move toward her. I didn't know, he said, his voice hoarse. I swear to you, Sophie, I didn't know. She couldn't do this. She couldn't. She turned, shoving the back door open so hard it nearly tore from its hinges. The night air hit her like a slap, cool and sharp against her burning skin. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stumbled into the strawberry fields, her feet carrying her deep between the rows of plants she had tended since childhood. This can't be real. She dropped to her knees, her fingers digging into the soil. The earth was solid beneath her, grounding her, but the world was still tilting, still spinning out of control. Alexander Hartley, the man whose name she had never spoken before today, the man who had built an empire, the man who had turned her away from his store without even knowing who she was. He was her father, and her mother had never told her. Why? Why had she kept this from her? A rustling sound behind her made her turn. She wiped at her face, furious that she was crying, that she felt like this. Alexander was standing a few feet away, his shoes sinking slightly into the dirt. His tie was gone, his expensive jacket discarded somewhere, and yet he still looked out of place. But his eyes were soft, hesitant, like he was afraid she might disappear if he got too close. I didn't come here to hurt you, he said quietly. Sophie clenched her hands into fists. You're too late for that. Alexander exhaled. I understand why you're angry. She laughed, but it wasn't really a laugh. It was a broken, shattered sound. You understand? She echoed, standing up. You understand what? That I just found out that my entire life was built on a lie? His face twisted. I never wanted this. If I had known, if you had known what? She cut in. Would you have done anything differently? Or would you have still chosen your money and your reputation over my mother? He flinched, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then softly he said, I would have chosen her. Sophie's breath hitched. But I was a coward, he admitted, looking away, his jaw tightening. And because of that, I lost you both. Silence stretched between them, heavy and unbreakable. For the first time, Sophie really looked at him. At the man who had unknowingly abandoned her. At the man who had spent years searching for someone who had already left. At the man who was trying now, too late, to make things right. Her heart was screaming at her to leave, to run, to pretend that nothing had changed. But everything had changed. And no matter how much she wanted to, she couldn't undo it. She could only decide what happened next. So could he. Finally, her voice barely above a whisper, she said, if you really want to fix this, prove it. Alexander's eyes lifted, startled. Prove to me, she said steady now, that you want to be my father. And in that moment, something shifted in his expression, something determined, something that said for the first time in his life, he wasn't going to let fear stop him. Alexander Hartley sat alone in the dimly lit study of his estate, his fingers tightening around the crystal glass in his hand. The rich amber liquid inside barely moved, but his grip trembled. His reflection in the polished wood of his desk stared back at him. A man who had built an empire, but lost the only thing that had ever truly mattered, a daughter. For 19 years, he had lived in ignorance. He had walked through life believing he understood loss, believing he had moved on from the past. But now the past had walked into his store carrying the face of the woman he had loved and the pain of a child who had never known him. He had missed everything. Her first steps, her first words, her childhood laughter, her scraped knees, her nights spent by candlelight doing schoolwork, all of it, gone, stolen by time. Stolen by choices he had made before he even knew they would cost him the only family he had left. Alexander exhaled sharply, his chest aching. No amount of wealth could turn back the clock. No amount of power could undo what had been done. But he wasn't ready to lose her now. Not again. Not when he had just found her. Sophie Carter sat curled up on the worn couch in her mother's cottage. Isubaong. Knees pulled to her chest. The house was quiet, but the silence felt different tonight. It wasn't the peaceful stillness she had grown up with. It was heavy, thick with unspoken words, thick with secrets that had shattered everything she thought she knew. Her mother sat across from her, hands clasped in her lap, her expression unreadable. Sophie had spent her entire life believing her father was either dead or a nameless man who had never cared enough to stay. She had imagined 100 different stories over the years. Maybe he was a drifter. Maybe he had been too young, too scared. Maybe he had never even known she existed. But this was so much worse. Her father wasn't dead. He wasn't a nobody. He was Alexander Hartley, the man who had built the biggest department store empire in the country, the man who had more money than he could ever spend, the man who had been too much of a coward to fight for her mother. And he had lived his entire life without ever looking for her. Sophie clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. I need to know the truth, she said suddenly, her voice shaking. Not just the parts you think I can handle, Mom. All of it. Evelyn Carter flinched. She hesitated, and Sophie's stomach twisted. She was hiding something else. Mom, Sophie whispered, her heart pounding. What are you not telling me? Evelyn exhaled shakily. She looked down at her lap, fingers tightening as if bracing herself for something unbearable. I left because I was pregnant, she said finally, her voice almost too quiet to hear. I left because if I stayed, they would have taken you away from me. Sophie's entire body stiffened. What? Her mother's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Alexander's father, the Hartley family. They would have never let me keep you, Sophie. I wasn't rich. I wasn't the right kind of woman for their world. And Alexander, she paused, shaking her head. He wasn't strong enough to stand up to them. So I left before they could take that choice away from me. Sophie's breath came in sharp gasps. All these years she had thought her father had abandoned them. But the truth was even worse. His family had seen her as a problem, something to erase, and he had let them. Sophie's stomach turned violently. She shot to her feet, knocking the blanket from her lap. "I have to go," she whispered. Her mother's eyes widened. "Sophie!" But she was already reaching for her coat, already throwing open the door. She couldn't breathe. She needed answers. It was late by the time Sophie arrived at the Hartley estate, but she didn't care. She stormed past the gates, her boots crunching against the gravel driveway. The mansion loomed before her like something out of a world she had never belonged to, its grand windows glowing with warm light against the cold night. She didn't hesitate. She pounded on the massive wooden doors, her entire body shaking with rage and hurt. It took less than a minute for them to open. And there he was, Alexander Hartley. He was still dressed in his suit from earlier, but his tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up. He looked tired, haunted. But Sophie didn't care. "You knew," she spat, stepping inside before he could stop her. "You knew they would have taken me away." His face drained of color. She let out a broken laugh, shaking her head. "You didn't just let my mother leave, you let her run for her life because your family thought I was a mistake, because you were too weak to stop them." Alexander swallowed hard, his hands clenching at his sides. "Sophie, listen." "No," her voice cracked. "You don't get to make excuses. You let 19 years pass without ever looking for me, without ever wondering if I was okay." "I did wonder," he said, his voice raw. "Every day I wondered. I searched for your mother, but she was gone, Sophie. I tried, not hard enough." The silence that followed was deafening. Tears blurred her vision. "You let them win." Alexander's face twisted, his chest rising and falling like he had been struck. "I did." Sophie wasn't prepared for the brokenness in his voice. His gaze dropped to the floor, and for the first time he looked small, lost. "I was young and I was afraid," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But fear isn't an excuse. It doesn't erase what I did, and it doesn't give me the right to ask for forgiveness." Sophie froze. She had expected him to argue, to justify, to find some way to make it less terrible than it was. But he didn't. He just stood there owning it. "I can't change the past," he said. "Toy," his voice rough, "but I can try to be better now, if you let me." Sophie wiped at her face furiously. She wanted to hate him. She wanted to scream that he didn't deserve a second chance. But the truth was, she wasn't sure what she wanted anymore. And that was the scariest part of all. Sophie Carter stood at the edge of the strawberry fields, the soft breeze carrying the scent of ripening fruit through the air. It was early morning, the sky still painted in soft hues of pink and gold. The world quiet except for the rustling leaves and the distant chirping of birds. This was her world. This was the place she had fought for, the life she had built alongside her mother, the land that had given them purpose when they had nothing else. And now everything was changing. She felt it every time she checked the mailbox and saw another envelope with the Hartley name stamped in gold. Every time a delivery truck pulled into their driveway, carrying things she hadn't asked for. Every time she caught herself hesitating, wondering for the first time in her life what it would have been like if she had known the man who had sent them. Her father, Alexander Hartley. Sophie sighed, gripping the handle of her basket, her fingers tightening. It had been weeks since she had confronted him, since she had forced him to admit the truth, that he had failed her, that he had let his family's power and influence dictate his life, that he had never once fought for her mother when it had mattered most. But what she hadn't expected was the way he fought now. Not with words, not with apologies, but with money. It had started small, a new irrigation system delivered to the farm without explanation, installed before she could protest. Then came new tools, shiny and expensive, meant to make her work easier. Then boxes of clothing, each item carefully selected, in colors he must have thought suited her. Then the letter. An offer, no, a promise that he would pay for anything she needed. If she wanted a university education, it was hers. If she wanted to travel the world, he would fund it. If she wanted nothing at all, then he would still make sure she never had to worry about money again. Sophie had stared at that letter for hours before shoving it into a drawer and locking it away. Because the truth was, she didn't want any of it. She didn't want his money. She didn't want to be indebted to him. She wanted the years back, the ones he had stolen from her without even knowing it. But no amount of wealth could buy back time, And the more he tried to fix things with gifts, the more she felt like he didn't understand her at all. A week later, another envelope arrived. This one was different. Inside was an invitation, a formal handwritten note from Alexander himself, inviting her to his estate for dinner. No gifts, no expectations, just him and her sitting down at the same table. Sophie's heart twisted. She wanted to say no. She wanted to ignore it, the way she had ignored everything else he had sent her. But she couldn't, not because she wanted his wealth, his influence, his power. Because deep down, she wanted to know. She wanted to know if there was anything left to salvage. The Hartley estate was even grander than she remembered. Massive stone pillars lined the driveway, leading to a mansion that looked like it had been plucked from a fairy tale. The perfectly manicured gardens stretched for acres, their beauty almost mocking her as she stepped out of the car. She didn't belong here. She had known that before, but she felt it now deep in her bones, as if every flower, every polished window, every perfectly placed stone in the pathway whispered the same thing. You are not one of us. Yet the doors opened for her, and he was there, waiting. Alexander Hartley stood in the grand foyer, his posture straight, his expression carefully controlled. But when he saw her, something shifted in his face, something almost like relief. Sophie, he said softly, as if saying her name meant something. She nodded stiffly. You said dinner, right? A small, almost hesitant smile tugged at his lips. Yes, just dinner. She followed him through the house, feeling the weight of history pressing down on her with every step. Massive paintings of the Hartley lineage lined the walls. Portraits of men who had built empires, who had passed down their legacy through generations of wealth and privilege. And now she was part of that legacy, not because she had been born into it, but because she had been kept away from it. The dining room was too large for just two people. A long mahogany table stretched between them, too much distance separating them. Sophie crossed her arms, staring at the untouched plates before her. I don't need any of this, you know. Alexander studied her for a long moment before speaking. I know, she scoffed. Do you? Because it feels like you're trying to buy my forgiveness. His expression didn't change. I'm not trying to buy it, Sophie. I'm trying to show you that I want to make things right. By throwing money at me? Her voice wavered with anger, but also something else, something she didn't want to name. Regret, sadness, loss. He sighed, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I don't know how to make up for all the years I missed, and I know you don't trust me. I don't blame you for that. She swallowed hard, caught off guard by his honesty. But I do know that I have spent my entire life believing that something was missing, he continued. I buried it beneath work, beneath responsibilities. I told myself I had done the right thing. And now, his voice dropped to a whisper. Now I know I was wrong. The rawness in his words hit Sophie harder than she expected. She looked down at her hands, at the familiar strawberry stains still clinging to her fingertips. I don't need a rich father, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I don't need designer clothes. I don't need a house like this. He nodded, watching her carefully. Then what do you need? Sophie's throat tightened. I need to know that you're not going to disappear again, she whispered. Alexander flinched, and for the first time, he looked truly, utterly broken. Sophie, he said hoarsely, I will never walk away again. The silence stretched between them, heavy with promises that could still be broken. Sophie exhaled shakily. I don't know if I can forgive you, she admitted. You don't have to, he said. Not yet. Not ever if that's what you decide. But I will keep showing up. I will keep trying. Sophie stared at him, her heart pounding. She wanted to believe him. She didn't know if she could. But for the first time, she saw something in him that had never been there before. Not power, not wealth, just a man, a father, trying to start over. And maybe, just maybe, she could try too. Sophie Carter stood at the grand entrance of Hartley Manor, her stomach twisting with nerves she didn't want to acknowledge. The air was crisp, the towering oak trees lining the long driveway swaying gently in the wind, but she barely noticed. Tonight was different. Tonight wasn't just about her father, the man who had suddenly reappeared in her life, trying to stitch together nearly 2 decades of lost time. Tonight was about her half-brother, James Hartley, the son who had grown up with everything she hadn't. The son who had lived under their father's roof, had sat at his grand dining table every night, had been raised knowing he belonged to the Hartley Empire. The son who, from what little she had heard, hated her already. Sophie swallowed hard, forcing her feet to move up the steps. The heavy doors opened before she could knock. A butler greeted her with stiff formality, leading her inside without a word, her hands clenched at her sides. She didn't belong here. She had thought she'd gotten used to that feeling after meeting Alexander, but stepping into the grand marble foyer of Hartley Manor, she felt it more acutely than ever. She wasn't just an outsider, she was an intruder, and James Hartley was waiting for her. The dining room was elegant and uncomfortably large. A long mahogany table stretched between them, shining under the glow of a crystal chandelier. It was set for three, but Sophie couldn't ignore the deliberate space between her seat and James's. It was a message, and she had received it loud and clear. James Hartley sat at the far end, dressed impeccably in a dark suit, his sharp features unreadable. He had the same piercing gaze as their father, but unlike Alexander's, there was no warmth in his eyes, just calculation, suspicion, and something that might have been anger. "So," he said, finally breaking the silence. His voice was smooth, controlled. "This is the long-lost daughter." Sophie stiffened. Not Sophie, not my sister, just the long-lost daughter, as if she were some inconvenient secret that had been dragged into the light. Her jaw tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I guess that makes you the long-found brother." James's lips twitched, just barely, as if amused by her defiance. But it didn't soften him. If anything, it made him lean back in his chair, studying her like a chess piece he needed to assess before making his next move. "And what exactly is it that you want?" Sophie's fingers curled around the napkin in her lap. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." James's gaze didn't waver. "You show up out of nowhere. My father suddenly showers a complete stranger with attention. And now here you are, sitting at this table. So tell me, what exactly do you want?" Her chest burned with indignation. Of course. Of course he thought she was after money. He thought she was here to claim a piece of the Hartley fortune, to carve out a share for herself in a life she had never been a part of. Sophie's voice was steady, but there was fire beneath it. "I didn't ask for any of this." James's expression remained unreadable. "Didn't you?" She leaned forward. "No, I didn't ask for a father who abandoned me. I didn't ask to be part of this family. I didn't ask to sit here and be interrogated like a criminal, and I sure as hell didn't ask for your approval." A flicker of something crossed James's face. Surprise, maybe, but it was gone in an instant. Alexander, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "James, that's enough." James exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "I don't think it is." He turned back to Sophie, eyes narrowing. "Because I don't believe for a second that you came here just to get to know our father. People like you don't come without expectations." Sophie slammed her napkin onto the table, pushing back her chair. "You know what? You're right." James's eyebrows lifted slightly, but Sophie wasn't done. "You're right. I did come here with expectations," she snapped. "I expected to meet a father who actually wanted to know me, not throw money at me. I expected to figure out if there was something worth salvaging between us. But what I didn't expect was to meet a brother who was so terrified of losing his privileged life that he'd rather assume I'm a gold digger than give me a chance." James's expression darkened, but she wasn't finished. "Here's the truth," she said, her voice unwavering. "I don't want a damn thing from you. I don't want your money. I don't want your inheritance. I don't want your stupid last name." She straightened her shoulders, unafraid now. "I just wanted to know if I had a family." Silence. The tension in the room was suffocating. For the first time, James looked unsure. And maybe, just maybe, a little guilty. Sophie turned to Alexander, her chest aching. "I thought maybe you really wanted to know me." Her voice cracked, just a little. "But I don't think I can do this, not if this is what family means to you." She grabbed her coat, her hands shaking, but before she could walk away, James finally spoke. "Wait." Sophie froze. His voice was quieter now, less sharp, less certain. She turned, meeting his gaze, and for the first time that night, she saw something real in his eyes. Doubt, regret, hesitation. "I James exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck, like he wasn't sure how to say what he needed to. Maybe I was wrong about you. Sophie swallowed hard. For the first time, James Hartley didn't look like a polished, untouchable heir to an empire. He looked like a man who had just realized he might have been the villain in someone else's story. Alexander, still seated at the table, watched the exchange silently. James sighed. Look, I don't trust easily, and I don't know you. His fingers tapped against the edge of the table, restless. But maybe we could change that. Sophie hesitated. A few hours ago, she had wanted nothing more than to leave and never look back. But now, she didn't know. Maybe despite everything, she wasn't ready to walk away just yet. Slowly, she exhaled. I'm not making any promises. Yeah, James smirked slightly, his defenses finally lowering. Neither am I. And for the first time that night, Sophie felt something shift. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a start. Sophie Carter stood in the heart of her family's strawberry fields, the warm afternoon sun painting golden streaks across the horizon. The scent of ripening fruit filled the air, mixing with the earth's rich aroma, grounding her in a way nothing else could. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening. To the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze, to the faint chirping of birds settling into the trees, to the quiet hum of life that had always existed here. This was her world. She had spent her entire life tending to these fields, waking before dawn to check on the plants, selling baskets of freshly picked berries in the market, learning every season's rhythm, every whisper of the soil beneath her fingertips. This farm was who she was. And yet, for the first time, she felt the weight of a choice pressing down on her, like a storm cloud hanging low over the earth. Because now she had another path, one paved in polished marble, lined with wealth and security, offered to her by a father who had suddenly reappeared, promising to make up for lost time. Alexander Hartley wanted her to be part of his world. He wanted to introduce her to boardrooms and luxury, to the kind of life where money was never a question and power was as natural as breathing. And for a moment, just a fleeting second, she had let herself wonder, what if? What if she left this place behind? What if she let herself belong to the Hartley name, to the fortune that had always been just beyond her reach? What if she stepped into the role of his daughter, fully and completely? Would it change her? Would it erase everything she had been before? Sophie exhaled slowly, opening her eyes. She already knew the answer. She could walk away from the farm, from the life she had built alongside her mother. But she would never truly belong in Alexander's world, because she was never meant to. Sophie wiped her hands on her jeans as she stepped into the greenhouse, the scent of fresh herbs and damp soil wrapping around her like a familiar embrace. She had come here to clear her head, to let her hands work while her mind sorted through the impossible tangle of emotions inside her. But as she reached for a crate of seedlings, a voice behind her made her pause. I didn't expect to find you here. Sophie turned, startled. A man stood in the doorway, leaning casually against the wooden frame, his arms crossed. His dark brown eyes were warm with curiosity, his hair tousled from the wind, and the faint trace of dirt on his shirt told her he was no stranger to farm work. Sorry, he added, flashing a lopsided grin. Didn't mean to scare you. Sophie narrowed her eyes slightly. Who are you? William Parker, he said, stepping forward and offering a hand. Your father asked me to meet you. Her stomach tightened. Of course, Alexander Hartley had sent him. She hesitated, then shook his hand. Firm grip, calloused fingers. A worker's hands. Not the kind of hands she expected from someone in her father's world. William must have noticed the tension in her expression because he chuckled. Relax. I'm not here to drag you into the Hartley Empire. Actually, I have no interest in that world either. Sophie raised an eyebrow. And then why are you here? He shrugged. Because your father thinks we have something in common. Sophie scoffed. I doubt that. William didn't seem offended. Instead, he glanced around the greenhouse, taking in the rows of plants, the careful irrigation setup, the baskets waiting to be filled. You care about this place, he said thoughtfully. Sophie crossed her arms. Of course I do. My mother and I built this farm from nothing. William nodded. Then I guess we do have something in common. Sophie frowned, confused. William leaned against one of the wooden tables, absent-mindedly running his fingers over a leaf. I run an organic farming collective, he explained. We help small farms expand, connect them with larger markets, improve sustainability, Get better equipment without losing what makes them special. Sophie stared at him. You mean without selling out to corporations? His smile deepened. Exactly. She couldn't help but feel a flicker of interest, because that was the part she had feared the most, losing control. If she accepted her father's help, it wouldn't be her farm anymore. It would become another Hartley project, another asset in his empire. But what William was talking about, it sounded like a way to grow without sacrificing her roots. Still, she hesitated. Why would my father want me to work with you? William's expression softened. Because he's trying to give you a choice, Sophie inhaled sharply. A choice. For weeks, it had felt like everything had been spinning out of her control, like she had been swept into Alexander Hartley's world before she even knew what was happening. But maybe for the first time, she was being offered a way forward that was truly her own. That evening, Sophie sat on the porch, the night air cool against her skin. She heard the car pull up before she saw it, the low rumble of the engine unmistakable. She didn't turn as Alexander stepped out, his footsteps slow as he approached. William spoke to you? He asked. She nodded. And? Sophie swallowed. I think I want to try it. She looked up at him then, meeting his gaze. But not because of you, because it's what I want. Something in his expression shifted, not disappointment, not frustration, just acceptance. That's all I ever wanted, he said quietly. Sophie exhaled, some of the weight on her chest easing, because maybe he really was trying. Maybe he wasn't just trying to pull her into his world, to shape her into something she wasn't. Maybe for the first time in his life, Alexander Hartley was learning how to let go. And maybe, just maybe, Sophie was learning how to let him in, on her terms. 1 month later, Sophie stood in the fields, watching as the first batch of strawberries was loaded onto a new delivery truck. Her farm was still hers, but now it was part of something bigger, connected to other small farms, sharing resources, growing in a way that didn't compromise its heart. William stood beside, his arms crossed, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. I think you're gonna like this, Sophie smirked. Don't get ahead of yourself, he laughed. Fair enough. She glanced toward the road where another car was pulling up. Alexander. This time her stomach didn't twist with nerves. This time she didn't feel like she had to choose between him and herself. She had already made her choice. And as she turned back to her farm, feeling the solid earth beneath her feet, Sophie knew one thing for certain. She had found her own path, and she wasn't looking back. Sophie Carter sat at her mother's worn wooden work table, the soft glow of candlelight flickering against the delicate sketches scattered across the surface. The smell of warm tea and lavender oil filled the small cottage, wrapping around her like a memory, familiar and safe. Across from her, Evelyn Carter worked in quiet concentration, her fingers carefully shaping a delicate silver pendant, her once unsteady hands now steady with purpose. For the first time in years, her mother was creating again. Sophie watched as she traced the outline of a new design, her brow furrowed in thought, her lips pressed together in a way that reminded Sophie of her own expressions when she was lost in focus. A few months ago, she would have never imagined this. Her mother, who had buried her past, sitting here, bringing old dreams back to life. But everything had changed since Alexander Hartley had come back into their lives. Not in the way she had expected, not in the way that had terrified her in the beginning. She had feared he would take over, that he would smother them in his wealth, try to rewrite their history, turn them into something they weren't. But instead, he had done something far more difficult. He had stepped back, he had listened, and in doing so, he had given them something money never could, a chance to reclaim what had been stolen from them. Evelyn set her tools down and exhaled softly, rubbing her hands together. It's strange, she murmured. Sophie tilted her head. What is? Her mother gave a small, wistful smile. I thought this part of me was gone. The designer, the artist. After I left Hartley's, after I became a mother, I convinced myself I had to let it go. Sophie's chest ached. You didn't have to let it go, Mom. Evelyn reached across the table, brushing her fingers over the golden strawberry brooch, the very piece that had started it all. I did, she said quietly. Back then, I had to make a choice. I chose you. Sophie swallowed hard, her throat tightening. Her mother had spent 19 years sacrificing. 19 years putting Sophie first, letting go of her own passions, her own dreams, because there hadn't been room for them. But now, for the first time, Sophie saw a spark in her mother's eyes, a spark that hadn't been there before. "You don't have to choose anymore," Sophie said, her voice gentle but firm. Her mother exhaled a small laugh, shaking her head. "No, I suppose I don't." And she didn't, because Alexander had given her this chance, not by forcing her back into his world, but by offering her a seat at the table again, on her own terms. The Lily Bennett collection, named after her mother's maiden name, was set to launch next month under Hartley's Fine Jewelry, not as a favor, not as charity, but because Evelyn Carter had earned it, because she was, and always had been, brilliant. Sophie's heart swelled with pride, not just for her mother, but for the woman she had fought so hard to be. The next evening, Sophie stood outside the Hartley estate, shifting her weight from foot to foot. The grand house still overwhelmed her. She wasn't sure if it ever wouldn't, but tonight she was here by choice. She knocked once. The door opened almost immediately. Alexander stood there, dressed in a sweater and slacks instead of his usual suit, looking more like a father than a CEO. "Sophie," he greeted, his voice careful as always, never assuming, never pushing. She took a breath. "Are you going to invite me in?" A flicker of surprise passed through his eyes, quickly replaced by something softer. Of course, he stepped aside, letting her in. The house was quieter than usual, warm. Sophie had expected it to feel cold, untouchable. But instead, the glow of a fireplace flickered in the distance, casting golden light against the deep oak walls. "James isn't here," Alexander said after a moment. Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Are you telling me that so I don't run?" A small smile tugged at his lips. "Maybe." She shook her head but didn't argue. The truth was, things with James were complicated. But less than before. They weren't enemies anymore. They weren't exactly siblings either. But they were trying, and that was more than she ever expected. Alexander led her to a smaller sitting room, a space she hadn't seen before. It wasn't formal, it wasn't intimidating, it was comfortable, like a place where family was supposed to gather. She hesitated before sitting down, the weight of the moment settling in. "I saw Mom's final collection pieces today," she said, breaking the silence. Alexander's eyes lit up. "And?" Sophie smiled, a genuine one. "They're incredible." He exhaled, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "She's always been incredible." Sophie studied him for a moment. "You're really proud of her, aren't you?" His expression turned serious. "I always was, Sophie, even when she wasn't in my life." The honesty in his voice took her by surprise. There was no self-pity in his words, no expectation for forgiveness, just truth. And maybe for the first time, she believed him. Sophie inhaled deeply, staring at the flickering fire. "I don't know what this is between us," she admitted. "I don't know what I want it to be." Alexander nodded. "That's okay." Silence settled between them, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't painful. It just was. For the first time, Sophie realized she didn't have to rush. She didn't have to forgive overnight. She didn't have to suddenly feel like she belonged in his world. She just had to try. And for tonight, that was enough. 1 week later, they all stood together, Alexander, Evelyn, Sophie, and even James, at the Hartley's Fine Jewelry launch event. The room was filled with journalists, designers, and some of the most influential people in the industry. But Sophie wasn't thinking about them. She was thinking about her mother, who stood at the front of the room presenting her work, speaking with confidence she had once lost. She was thinking about Alexander standing beside her arm, looking at Evelyn the way a man does when he knows he lost the best thing in his life, but is grateful just to see her shine again. She was thinking about James, who had nudged her earlier, muttering, "This is kind of cool, I guess," before stealing a glass of champagne from a waiter. And she was thinking about herself, standing in the middle of it all, belonging to both worlds, the one she had grown up in and the one she had just begun to understand. Not because she had chosen one over the other, but because she had chosen herself. And maybe, just maybe, she had found a way to keep them both. The sky was painted in hues of deep purple and fiery orange as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the strawberry fields. The warm scent of ripe fruit lingered in the air, mixing with the crisp evening breeze. Sophie Carter stood at the edge of the fields, her arms crossed over her chest as she watched the last of the day's work come to an end. Workers gathered their baskets, laughing and chatting as they made their way back to the cottage, their silhouettes dark against the golden light. This place, her place, had changed so much in the past few months. The small, struggling farm had become something more. With the help of William Parker, her business had grown in ways she had never imagined. They had expanded their reach, securing partnerships with organic markets, restaurants, and even Hartley's high-end food hall. The farm, once teetering on the edge of survival, was now thriving. And yet, it wasn't the success that made Sophie's heart feel full tonight. It was the people. It was the sound of her mother's laughter drifting from the kitchen window where she and Alexander were preparing dinner together. It was the sight of James sitting on the porch steps, flipping through spreadsheets for the farm's finances, grumbling under his breath, but doing it anyway. And it was the way William stood beside her now, his hands in his pockets, his easy smile pulling at the corners of his mouth as he followed her gaze. "You're staring at the farm like it might disappear," he teased. Sophie exhaled a soft laugh, shaking her head. "I guess I'm just taking it all in." William nudged her lightly with his shoulder. "It's a lot, huh?" She nodded, her throat tightening slightly. "Yeah, it is. Because everything was different now." A year ago, she had been nothing more than a girl selling strawberries at the market, her world confined to the small patch of land she and her mother worked tirelessly to keep afloat. Now she had a father who was trying, a brother who had finally stopped resenting her, a business that was hers and hers alone. And then there was William. He had arrived in her life like a quiet storm, unexpected and steady, never demanding anything from her except the truth. And the truth was, she didn't know what she would do without him anymore. They had spent hours together over the past few months, walking through the fields, discussing new crops, arguing over finances, planning how to make sure the farm never lost what made it special. At first, she had been wary of him. She had thought he was just another person sent by her father, another outsider trying to control something that wasn't theirs. But William wasn't like that. He didn't try to fix things for her. He didn't act like she was some charity project. He just helped, and in doing so, he had become part of her world. "You're quiet tonight," William said, tilting his head as he studied her. "That's a rare thing." Sophie smirked. "Maybe I'm just tired of arguing with you." "Impossible," he shot back. "It's basically your favorite hobby." She rolled her eyes but didn't argue, because maybe it was true. Maybe she liked the way they challenged each other. The way he never let her take the easy way out. The way he saw her, not as the daughter of Alexander Hartley, not as the girl who had spent her life in the market, but as Sophie, just Sophie. She turned to face him fully, taking in the way the last rays of sunlight cast a golden glow over his face. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her voice quieter now. William nodded. "Of course." Sophie hesitated. "Why did you stay?" He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "You didn't have to," she said. "You came here to help the farm, and now it's doing fine. You could have left, gone back to your business, your life, but you didn't." William was silent for a long moment. Then finally he said, "Because I wanted to." Sophie's breath caught. William turned toward her, his eyes serious now. No teasing, no deflection. "I thought I was coming here to help you build something," he admitted. "But somewhere along the way, I realized I didn't want to leave." Sophie's heart pounded. "Why?" A slow, almost hesitant smile crossed his lips. "Because I realized I wasn't just building something with you." His voice softened. "I was falling for you." Sophie felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She had never been the girl who dreamed of love. She had never been the girl who needed someone to complete her. And yet, standing here now, looking into his eyes, she realized she wasn't losing herself. She wasn't giving anything up. She was choosing this, choosing him. Slowly, she stepped closer. "You know, for someone who likes to talk business all the time, that was kind of romantic." William chuckled, shaking his head. "Don't get used to it." Sophie smirked. "No promises." And then, before she could talk herself out of it, she leaned up and kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, almost unsure. But then his hands cupped her face, and suddenly it was everything. It was the warmth of the sun on her skin, the solid ground beneath her feet, the quiet certainty that, for once in her life, she wasn't alone. When they pulled away, William's forehead rested against hers, his breath uneven. Finally, he murmured, a grin tugging at his lips. Sophie laughed, shaking her head. You're so full of yourself. You like it, he teased. And maybe she did. Maybe she always had. As Sophie walked back toward the house later that night, James was waiting for her. He stood with his arms crossed, leaning against the porch railing, watching her with a raised eyebrow. Well, that was a long walk, he commented. Sophie rolled her eyes. Don't start. James smirked. Not my fault you're making it so obvious. She sighed, but there was no heat in it. Do you ever stop being annoying? Not likely. Sophie hesitated, then sat down beside him. You're handling this better than I expected. James shrugged. If he's stupid enough to deal with you, that's his problem. Sophie laughed, really laughed, and for the first time she realized James wasn't just tolerating her anymore. He was accepting her, maybe even protecting her in his own annoying big brother way. Thanks, James, she said, nudging him lightly. He rolled his eyes. Yeah. Just don't expect me to make a speech at your wedding. Sophie froze. James grinned. Relax, little sister, he said. We all saw this coming before you did. She groaned. I hate you. But she didn't. She never had. She just hadn't known until now that she had been missing a brother all along. As the night settled over the farm, Sophie realized something. She had spent so much of her life thinking she had to fight alone. But now she had a family, a father who was trying, a brother who had finally let her in, and a man who had chosen to stand by her side. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the future, because she wasn't facing it alone. 1 year later, Sophie Carter stood in the middle of her strawberry fields, the golden light of the setting sun painting the landscape in warm hues. The gentle hum of the evening breeze carried the scent of fresh earth and ripening fruit, wrapping around her like an embrace. This was where it had all started. And somehow, after everything, this was where it had all come back to. She let her fingers graze the leaves of the strawberry plants, feeling the soft brush of the fruit beneath her touch. These fields had been her whole world once, a place of struggle, a place of survival, a place of memories filled with both pain and love. A year ago, she had felt trapped here, fighting to keep the farm afloat, wondering if she was meant for more. But now it wasn't just a farm anymore. It was a legacy, a thriving business that supported her community, supplied markets and restaurants, and even stocked the shelves of Hartley's Fine Foods, the very store she had once been turned away from. She had come full circle, and she had done it on her own terms. She turned her gaze toward the cottage. So much had changed inside those walls. Her mother, Evelyn Carter, no longer carried the quiet sadness in her eyes that she had once lived with for years. Instead, she radiated purpose, designing new jewelry collections that bore her name, a name that had been buried for far too long. She had stopped looking back at the past with regret. She had started living again. And then there was Alexander Hartley, the father she had once sworn she would never forgive. He still came to visit, though never unannounced. He had learned to give her space, to let her decide what kind of relationship she wanted. She still didn't call him Dad. Maybe she never would, but he was here, and for now that was enough. James, her once cold half-brother, was sitting on the porch steps, scrolling through something on his phone, pretending not to be invested in the farm's profits, while subtly keeping track of every financial decision she made. He was still annoying, still proud, but he was her brother now, and she wouldn't trade that for anything. Then there was William. He was standing a few feet away, talking to the workers, his sleeves rolled up, dirt streaking his hands as he helped load a shipment of strawberries onto the delivery truck. She smiled, watching him. What had started as a business partnership had turned into something so much more. He had been patient, had waited for her to trust him, to believe in them, and now she couldn't imagine her life without him. As she walked toward the cottage, William caught sight of her, flashing that easy grin that still made her heart race. Thinking about running away again? He teased. Sophie smirked. Nah, figured I'd stay a little longer this time. He stepped closer, brushing his fingers against hers. Good. I was hoping you would. Sophie exhaled, looking around at everything they had built, everything they had fought for. A year ago, she had been so afraid of losing herself, afraid that meeting her father, stepping into his world, would erase everything she was, but instead it had made her stronger. She had learned to take what she needed and leave the rest. She had learned that success wasn't about wealth, it was about happiness. She had learned that family wasn't just about blood, it was about the people who chose to stand by you. And most of all, she had learned that she wasn't just a strawberry girl. She was a fighter, a businesswoman, a daughter, a sister, a woman who had built her own life on her own terms. Sophie's story isn't just about her, it's about all of us. How many times in life do we let our circumstances define us? How often do we feel like we don't belong, like we aren't enough? Sophie's journey reminds us that where we start doesn't have to define where we end. She could have stayed bitter. She could have rejected her father completely. She could have walked away from the farm, chased after an easier life. But instead, she chose herself. She chose to build, to forgive, but not forget, to love, but not lose herself. And that's a lesson for all of us. No matter where you come from, no matter what challenges you face, your life is yours to create. Success isn't about money. It's about happiness. It's about staying true to yourself. And sometimes it's about learning when to let people in and when to walk away. As the last shipment of strawberries rolled out of the farm, Sophie stood on the porch, watching the sunset. William slid his arm around her waist, pressing a kiss to the side of her head. James muttered something about how he still wasn't a fan of the romance. Alexander laughed, his voice lighter than she had ever heard it. Evelyn smiled, her eyes filled with pride. And Sophie? She just breathed. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for something to go wrong. She wasn't running. She wasn't trapped. She was just happy. And that was enough. For now and for always. What did you learn from Sophie's story? Has her journey inspired you? Let's talk in the comments. If you love Sophie's journey, hit like and share to spread the message of strength and resilience. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story like this. New heart-touching stories are coming your way. Your support makes all the difference. Drop a comment below to cheer Sophie on. Remember, life isn't about where you start. It's about what you choose to build.